Welcome to the Texas Conflict Coach radio program. If you've ever experienced or engaged in destructive or unresolved conflict, then you know it leads to broken relationships, distrust, and damaging results. Our program will help you manage and resolve conflict effectively with strategies, valuable resources, and support. Since 2009, our radio program hosted guest experts from around the globe sharing their perspectives, experiences, and expertise while giving you food for thought. If you can't listen live, then download and listen to any of our 300-plus podcasts in our library at texasconflictcoach.com. So sit back, relax, or join the conversation every Tuesday evening, or tweet us at TXConflictCoach.
As part of our Conflict Workplace series, Jay Berman with the American Institute of Mediation, or AIM, will share his experience and expertise as an executive coach, working with organizations and senior leadership in managing conflict in a proactive way. In this episode, Blinder Than a Bat, what organizations and leaders need to do to remove their conflict blind spots. We find that organizations and leaders have blind spots when it comes to understanding, recognizing, and managing conflict constructively. It is not uncommon for leaders to be blind to how their behaviors, body language, and communication impact staff in negative ways, especially when it comes to rising conflict. Organizations have blind spots, too, when it comes to handling problem leaders. Not recognizing these blind spots perpetuates the situations. Organizations and leaders will learn the key blind spots and how to remove them in this episode. Now, we have with us again Jay Berman. He is a full-time mediator from 19 years ago. He has successfully mediated over 1,700 matters and is a panelist at PMA Dispute Resolution, a boutique firm based in Los Angeles. Now, in addition to the AAA National Panels, he has been named to a bevy of top neutrals list and is a member of the several other distinguished mediation organizations, including among them the International Academy Mediators and the National Academy of Distinguished Neutrals. Now, he's also a permanent trainer and prominent trainer as well. Not permanent, but just also very prominent. Jay in the field. He's been around for a long time. But Jay did found the American Institute of Mediation in 2008, leaving his position as director of Pepperdine Law School's mediating the litigated case, and this was a program that he did for 7 years. He's also lectured and trained at a dozen different universities and law schools, as well as for mediators, judges, and business leaders across the U.S., and in India, Australia, Jordan, Croatia, Amsterdam, and Dubai. Now, Jay was the inaugural ADR director for the Santa Barbara County Superior Court, and he also had a radio talk show and now authors the popular blog Eye on Conflict. So we have a wonderful expertise coming to us today, and I want to thank you, Jay, for joining us on the program.
Oh, Patty, it's my pleasure. I'm so happy to be with you.
Well, you're a very experienced radio show host as well, so I'll have to take some pointers and tips from you as we go along. Now, tonight, we are taking live callers, and you can simply call 347-324-3591, and we're encouraging comment and questions. We already have the chat room open, and we already have guests in our chat room, so that's another way that you can join us. You simply go to blogtalkradio.com/Texas-conflict-coach, and you can engage us in the chat room as well. And finally, if you're on Twitter, we're using the hashtag TCCRadio, and certainly you can make your comments and questions there. We'll bring them into the show. So, Jay, you wear a lot of hats, mediator, trainer, and then, surprisingly, I found out that you were also an executive coach. So how did you find your way into this work, and how did your practice evolve to include all of these roles?
Well, it's a great question, Patty. I moved to this field from real estate development, and I started noticing how our negotiations in that world were very much about squeeze every nickel out of your opponent on every deal, and I knew that was a formula for failure, and I knew that the deals that went better were the ones that ended up with a real win-win, and where we were working together toward a solution. So I took a mediation training course to figure out how to transition those competitive discussions into more collaborative ones, and that launched the mediation thing a long time ago. March, as you've said, March will be 20 years for me as a mediator. And the transition into training and then executive coaching was really simple, because I found when I was sitting in rooms, in mediations, having discussions with people, business people, whoever, and their lawyers, my style was very, I think like yours, Patty. Mine was a very coaching kind of style in those moments of conflict. So I'd be saying to them, it looks to me like you've got these three choices. Let's walk each one out and see how that plays out down the road long term. And let's make some decisions about how to handle this negotiation to get you going in the direction you want to go. And I found through executive coaching training and other things that I did, that executive coaching was really very much the same thing. It's just helping people see different perspectives and helping them make choices and empowering them. And so the work is really not that different. It's just a different setting.
Okay, great. Well, and you're right. There's a lot of crossover tools, skills, and strategies that we utilize in whatever the conflict situation that's posed to you, whether you're working with a senior leader in an organization or you're mediating between, maybe an equal employment opportunity dispute or some other type of dispute in an organization. Certainly if you're training, you're bringing those skills and educating folks, but as an executive coach, or working with teams. So a lot of those strategies do come into play, and it seems like it's a natural fit for you.
Well, I think it is for both of us, right? Because we like helping people manage their way through conflict more effectively, and whether that means they're in response to a conflict, whether in a mediation, or we're trying to help them work in a positive direction and avoid conflict with a coaching kind of a mode, or your conflict coaching that's right in between the way I see it. We're helping them regardless of the venue, and that's, I think, what you and I share.
Well, absolutely. And so in helping businesses and organization leaders, especially those who are in conflict or in protracted disputes, what do you typically experience and how organizations deal with conflict?
If there's a rug, they'll sweep it under.
Yes.
I find organizations like to be in their core business. They like to be playing to their strength. They like to be making the widgets they make or delivering the service they deliver. And they really like not to be bogged down by anything that slows them. I think of a runner running a steeplechase or something. When they hit the water and the mud, it slows them down. And I think unfortunately, that's the eye with which most organizations look at conflict. They don't tend to see the opportunity that lies in that conflict. They tend to go to, it's another one of these. It's going to slow us down and mess us up.
So is the tendency then, in your experience, for them to avoid the bog, if you will, or the mud, or or do you find something else is happening?
No, I think you're right. I think they ignore it. They turn their back on it. They try to pretend that it's not there. And they tend to, there's a difference between managing a conflict and solving a problem. And I think what they tend to do is try to manage problems. If they have a problem employee, they'll move them from department to department and try different supervisors and do things to avoid having a difficult discussion. And I think anything that I think most organizations are conflict averse, and to the extent that they can avoid a difficult conversation, they'll do that. So by empowering them to have those conversations better, they can face them, resolve them, and get back to running on dry ground again.
Well, and I like the point that you made about a lot of times it's about, like, for example, the problem employee. They move them around, they promote them up, all kinds of interesting things that they do, and the idea is how can they take a more proactive approach. Now, specifically as an executive coach, I know that you practice as a mediator, but probably also in teams facilitating that. But specifically as an executive coach, you see blind spots that leaders are not aware of, and for that matter, organizations experience as well. But why don't you define what a blind spot is first for our listeners?
Well, to me, a blind spot is something that's right smack in front of somebody, but they don't see it, whether it's because they choose not to or they've just conditioned themselves not to see it. It's a little bit like if you have a stain on the carpet. When it first happens, you freak out, you grab the spot remover and do everything you can to get rid of it. But after it's there for a week, you just sneer at it when you walk by. And after it's there for 6 months, you don't even see it anymore. You walk right past it, and you've developed a blind spot for it where you don't even notice it. And one day you see it, and you say, my gosh, I've been walking past this spot for 3 months, forgot that there was a spot there, even though it was staring you right in the face. So we develop blind spots consciously and unconsciously, but they keep us from seeing the obvious.
Even if someone's screaming at us.
Yes.
Sometimes I hear my carpet spot screaming at me, and I imagine that's an employee screaming at the boss about their blind spot, and they're still ignoring it.
Yes. It's amazing that an employee will be yelling at a boss saying, you treat people so badly, you don't deserve to be in management, and, they'll be going on and on. And they'll finish, and the boss will say, well, it sounds like you have a problem with my management style, or it sounds like you're upset about something happening here at the office. And they will have not heard the whole message. It's amazing the human capacity for avoiding conflict if that's their MO.
Absolutely. Okay, so why don't we give an example of a blind spot that you have found in leaders? And I imagine that there might be a pattern out there amongst leaders in different organizations. So what's an example?
Well, one great example is I do a lot of work with professional service providers, whether they're, accountants or lawyers or business consultants or whoever they are. They're in another workspace where they're serving clients all day, and they're coming back to their firm or their team, and the team then has to respond to the client request. And I find the most common blind spot is they'll treat the client like they're golden. They'll, bend down and kiss the client's shoes and polish them and say, tell me what you want, tell me when I can get it to you. And I understand that. That's called making a sale and servicing the client, and those are all very, very important things to do. But then they'll come back to the ranch, and they'll turn on their team and say, he needs this tomorrow. Everybody's got to work all night long. And instead of saying, imagine the opportunity we have here for this client's head to spin when we walk in tomorrow with this done and delivered when they know they just gave it to us at 4 o'clock this afternoon. Imagine how excited and impressed they're going to be and what other opportunities that's going to open up for us. Instead, they say, and I don't want to hear any complaints, and you're going to stay all night long, and they treat their team like second-class citizens. And the team are the very ones who are trying to make them look good when they, the partner, the leader, the captain of the team, has to go back in and present to the client the next day. So one of the blind spots, I think, is seeing the ability to see that they treat people in their world that vastly differently. And if any of them could see a videotape of it or get direct feedback from their teams about it, it's really, truly eye-opening and hurts their feelings when they see it. It's amazing to see people say.
It's interesting because, obviously when the leader approaches their team as second-class citizens, you would expect that some members of the team are more vocal than others and give feedback or say something, or it sounds maybe like complaining, but yet the leader seems to be blind to the impact that they're having on their team. And do you find that as well?
Oh, yeah. Some leaders look at it and maybe they've got a more sort of military style of leadership, and they think, well, I'm sharpening their tool, I'm making them better, and, one day they too will be the captain of a team like this, and, they'll be ready for it, and they'll be prepared because I've been hard on them. And really what they're doing is just crushing every bit of spirit they have and every bit of motivation and desire they have to work for that captain, and the captain just doesn't see it at all. It's amazing.
Even though, like you said, it's right in front of them.
Yeah, and like you said, even though they're getting feedback, the employers are saying to them, you shouldn't talk to us like this, and then, they come back with answers like, well, that's how I was talked to when I was coming up, and I came out fine. I mean, it's not unlike parenting. It's the same kind. I walked uphill to school in the snow both ways. You can certainly put down your video game during the dinner table, or whatever that kind of analogy might be.
But, you said something else I wanted to underscore, and that is if they were to watch a videotape of themselves or watch a videotape of how people really feel or how they're really impacted, that all of a sudden they become shocked or dismayed about or upset and disappointed in themselves, or, oh my gosh, I didn't know they felt that way, and then it's a completely different, it's like someone either just, shined a light on them or, ripped off their blinders or something of that nature that all of a sudden they're seeing.
It's true. As an executive coach, a lot of where I start with my clients is by doing a 360-degree interview. So I meet with their clients, I meet with their bosses, I meet with the people who are their peers at the same level, and I meet with the teams that work for them. And I get feedback from a dozen or so people, in-depth, drilled-down feedback. When you say so-and-so is hard to work for, tell me what do you mean? What do you point to? When do they get upset? And what seems to trigger them? And how do they act when they get upset? So I gather all this information. I compile it for them, and when I go back and sit down with them and spend 2.5, 3 hours saying, let me walk you through all of the comments that people have made about what it feels like to work with you, half of them break down into tears, and most of them are stunned that people actually feel some of the ways that they do. So I take that to mean that the most courageous thing and the most helpful thing that a person can do if they're managing other people, if they're working with peers, which everybody does at some level, is ask them for feedback. How am I doing? If I could get better at 1 or 2 or 3 things, what would they be? And then hearing that feedback, they can. It helps them shine a light on that blind spot earlier in their career and more voluntarily, so that it's not somebody giving them a report one day or some employee quitting, a prize employee quitting because they're just too hard to work for and they don't get blindsided by it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we're gonna come back to the feedback piece in just a moment. So, listeners, you are tuned in to the Texas Conflict Coach Blog Talk Radio program, and I'm speaking with Jay Berman of the AIM Institute. That's the American Institute of Mediation. He wears many, many hats, and we've been talking about blind spots, the things that are right in front of us that we just don't seem to see or hear. And Jay just talked through a couple of examples of what a blind spot is for leaders. But one of the things I wanted to ask you, Jay, before we move on to this constructive feedback piece is that why is it that organizations seem to have the same blind spots when it comes to these same leaders? So say more about that.
It's a good point, Patty. I think part of it is denial. Part of it sometimes is inevitably it's the largest rainmakers, or it's the biggest salespeople, or it's the most successful people in the organization who might also have a personality that drives people away because they're overly aggressive or ambitious or demanding or something like that. And so what I find a lot of times is leadership makes the decision to let them just be because we don't want to lose them or upset them because they're the ones bringing in the bacon. So there's a lot of that goes on. The other thing is it's up to an organization to structure its culture in a way that values and normalizes the sharing of conflict. There's one organization I work with where when they come out of a pitch or a business meeting or something, they immediately go sit down around a table and say, okay, let's go around the table and give feedback. And people will say, well, I thought when you said this to their president, he flinched and you missed it and you kept going, or whatever it is. And they ask for it, they crave, they value the feedback because they're trying to get better and better and better. And I have another organization I work with where it's just the opposite, where rather than go to that person and say, boy, you really could have done a better job in that meeting. Can I help you see some of what I saw? Instead, they go tell 6 other people what a bad job John did in that meeting, and nobody tells John. And I saw that's where the blind spot develops in the organization. End of year, they give feedback to everybody, and all of that goes up to leadership, and leadership sees feedback that says, oh, John's a great guy. And it doesn't say, John could work on some of his finite communication skills. John really needs to engage the client better in a pitch meeting, or, really helpful stuff that would make John better at it so it doesn't come up again the next year.
I was working recently, earlier this year, on a case where there were two individuals who were in a great deal of conflict with each other, and yet they weren't getting the feedback that they needed from their organizational leaders. They themselves were at a mid-level leadership position, but the organizational leaders were very conflict averse, and so this went on and on and on, and for 8 years, basically.
Wow.
And so here I get the call, probably just like you do. Yes, we've been, in conflict. I know. How long has it been going on? Oh, I think my longest one was 15 years before they decided to pick up the phone. But the reason they did that is because they had a new leader. They were rotating through leaders. And every leader that came on would just, ignore it. It was a blind spot. They just didn't know what to do with it. And this new leader is like, enough is enough. We need to give them some feedback. And when these employees finally got the feedback, they were totally shocked. They're like, if this was a problem, and they were very high performers, if this was a problem, why didn't you tell me? Why did people wait 8 years? It must not really be us. It really must be you. There's something wrong with you, new leader, that you're giving us feedback because no one else has complained to us about it for 8 years.
Yeah.
And that's what they do. They're in such shock, And so this constructive feedback, this is one of those strategies you're talking about. So talk a little bit more about this kind of constructive feedback, and really it needs to be a very focused, intentional feedback. So say more about this strategy.
This is rather programmatic, this particular kind of thing, where somebody engages me as a coach, and we'll talk about what their perception, what people's perception of them is in the organization. And we'll have a conversation that usually ends with, I'd like to start with a baseline understanding of how people experience working with me so that I know what behaviors to change. I know I need to work on A, B, and C. My boss has told me I should work on D and E, but I want to know what else is out there. And they actually ask for the blind spots. Because if they're calling in an executive coach to help them be more effective, they know that there must be blind spots, and they're open to it. So then I go gather the feedback and come back and sit with them. We go through it all. And then from that feedback, it's not just enough to get the feedback, although some of the items will make them sort of flip a switch and just change behavior. Like you said, they'll just say, well, why didn't somebody just tell me? But most of it is the kind of feedback that at the end of receiving it, they need to make a plan that says, okay, I clearly need to get better at these 5 or 6 key things. Here are the details. Here's the action plan. Here's what I'm going to do to help me focus on those specific things. Here's who I'm going to engage to help me. I'm going to ask my team to give me feedback if they find me being too harsh. I'm going to ask, so-and-so to give me feedback if I talk down to him or, whatever it is. And they're going to work with the executive coach to work through those issues and to get coaching and training and education and perspective and all those sorts of things. And then they're going to set a timeline for it, because some of it can be done in the next 60 days, and some of it's going to be gradually over a 6 or 12-month period as they need to develop better relationships in certain parts of the company or firm or something like that. So it really is about taking the feedback and then acting on it, and in a very programmatic way, in a way that says, this is a clear definition. These are exactly the things I'm going to do. Here are the very people I'm going to meet with once a month to make sure I'm staying on top of them. And, those are the only things that really mobilize people to change, is having a specific plan like that comes from the feedback that they're given.
But I imagine in what you described are people who are, something's happened that's self-motivating them to be open, for getting that feedback from your 360. But I imagine there's some of them that are probably pretty darn resistant and defensive.
There are. Some of them are put into a program like that. They're told that we're going to get you a coach because we think as a team that you have some issues, and those folks come in with their arms folded and resistant, of course. Or they come in saying, wow, my team says I have issues. Let's get to the bottom of this and let's go after it. So what I find is it's the underperformers who get the sort of remedial, we've got to not just sort of sand down these rough edges. We need to sort of hack off a limb with a saw here. Or it's the people at the other end of the organization. It's, so-and-so is a rising star or is an up-and-comer or is a leader in the firm already or in the company, and we want to hone their leadership skills because we have big plans for them, and we see them one day in a very leadership role within our organization, and we want to make sure that they have all the people skills, all the strategic management skills, all the organizational skills, and everything in place. And so it's a little like continuing education, if you will, but it's very, very specialized for that person.
Okay, so as we begin, we still have another 5 minutes, and we'll start to wind down here. So what recommendations do you have for leaders and organizations to help them kind of rip off those blinders before they even get to a coach? Because, a lot of times, things get to a certain point, and that could even be to a point of someone filing a grievance, or now someone's threatening a lawsuit or EO complaint. So what would you recommend to people who are listening to this show about what they need to do before it even gets to that level of needing a coach, for example?
Great question. And I'm going to steal here from one of my mentors because it's the best answer I've ever heard. It's the easiest to remember. The mentor is Jim Malamed, who is a mediator up in Oregon and was one of my very first teachers 19 years ago. And he said, if you're going to give somebody feedback, give it to them like an Oreo cookie. Start them off with something sweet. Tell them something good. Then cream them. and then finish them off with a piece of chocolate, just like an Oreo cookie standing on its side. And truthfully, one of the biggest challenges is though organizations think they give feedback, they tend to give it only the negative. They tend to say, you need to get better at that, or, your attendance needs to improve, or your attitude, or whatever. So they'll give them the brash feedback without anything positive. The way to give feedback that way is to say, start them off with a cookie, is to say, we really value you in this organization. We think that with a couple of changes, a couple of tweaks, a couple of adjustments, you can go a long way in this organization, and we think you've got incredible talent. What we think we need to do is work with you on some of your people skills because we've heard some feedback that says that, or, we've had some of your team members quit lately or, whatever, and in their exit interviews they've said that you can be difficult to work with at times because of A, B, and C. So we'd love to have you take a look at A, B, and C and do some work on that. And finishing off with a cookie, you say, because I think if you'll adjust A, B, and C and quiet down that bit of noise in the system, that you're going to be positioned for a very, very bright future here. So we hope that you'll put the time and effort into working on those things and take this seriously because we think it'll pay off for you in the long run.
Well, and the key to the Oreo is give it to them early.
Exactly.
Wouldn't it? Versus, 8 years later, they should be doing this Oreo much early on in their, career, or when they start to hear that chatter, that noise, that static in the system as you talk about, and be consistent, because why wait 1 year for the performance review?
Exactly.
And be specific. Get really specific when you, like you said, when you cream them, you better be very specific on what it is you're asking them to change.
Exactly. And I think earlier the better, and it's important for leadership to know and organizations to understand that if the first time Bob hears this feedback is when he doesn't get the promotion and Sally does, and they say, well, Bob, you have these people issues, and no one's told him before, saving face for Bob means I now have to leave the company because apparently I'm not good enough to get this vice presidency or this senior partner, whatever status, and apparently I've had this problem for a long time with people that I don't really understand. No one's taken the time to invest in me and explain it to me, and apparently they've all known it and I haven't, so I'm nothing but a fool. So I'm going to go find another job where I can start fresh. And unfortunately, Bob goes and gets an executive coach on his own when he starts the new job to make sure he doesn't have those problems, and the organization loses what could have been a valuable leader.
Absolutely. And you see that way too many times, or even not only valuable leaders, but very valuable employees. Now, as we transition to our assignment for the week, we usually do some kind of call to action or something that encourages, listeners who are tuning in to really take the next step in what it is that they're hearing. So what is it you have for our listeners today?
This one's a tough one. It's not really tough, but it's going to be tough for every one of them, and I really hope that they'll do it. The assignment is to sit quietly and think of the 3 things that bother you the most that your loved one or your teenage child or your boss or your assistant or somebody very close to you does that drive you crazy. Bend to it courageously and have a conversation with them. Have an Oreo conversation. It can be 3 things with one person, or it can be 3 different conversations with 3 different people. It's a conversation where you're saying to them, when you do this, I feel this. I feel frustrated. I feel angry. I feel disappointed. And what would really help me out is if you'd be willing to do this the next time instead. And have that person say either, oh, I'm glad you told me, I can do that, that's easy. Or say, gee, I didn't realize that bothered you, tell me more about it. Or say, yeah, okay, well, I'll try. But in any event, I want our listeners to have 3 of those courageous conversations, or at least tackle 3 issues with one person very close to them, so that they can practice the Oreo, so that they can get what they want from the people who are close to them and see just how easy it is to have that conversation. And then for extra credit, if they'll say, and can you give me a thing or 2 that I do that bother you that you'd like to see me work on? And ask for feedback. That's it.
Okay, so practice giving the feedback by thinking of those 3 things, and the extra credit is receive it.
Exactly.
The feedback.
Ask
without
for
defensiveness.
Yep, exactly. Hear it and take it as an opportunity for you to grow and become even more effective at what you do, even if what you do is just being a dad or a mom or a wife or a husband, all those sorts of things.
All the different roles that so many of us play.
Exactly.
Okay, fabulous. So listeners, you have your assignment for the week to call to action, and of course you can re-listen to this podcast once it has finished recording so that you can get all of the wonderful tidbits and information that we talked about today. So Lee J, where do people find you? Because you're all over the place. Where do you want people to come look for you?
The easiest place is just leejayberman.com, LeeJayberman.com. And from there they can go to executive coaching or mediation or training or anywhere they want to.
Oh, well, then that makes it really simple because you have some wonderful, not only websites, but you're on Facebook and Twitter and all the social networks that people can connect with you there. And I imagine all your social networks are on your Lee J. Berman site.
I hope so.
Yeah.
But if not,
well,
they can find me on
if they're not,
Facebook,
they can
LinkedIn.
email you and say, hey, what's your Twitter?
Exactly.
Well, I really appreciate you having this conversation with me as part of our Workplace Conflict series this month and honoring Conflict Resolution Day, which was last Thursday. We had that, and we've been loving and wanting to have you on the show for a long time, and I thank you so much for doing that. What final message do you want to leave with listeners?
Don't laugh. My message to leave with the listeners is to say to them that what you're doing by having this show and educating them every week about how to manage conflict and work through conflict and become more conflict competent is so precious. I want to leave them with, you have 50 opportunities this year to hear Patty talk to people about conflict and to get her input. And that's the thought that I would leave them with, is to become regular, steady listeners and sponges of your show, because you offer so much with the guests you bring on and your own knowledge and background that's just so rich and deep. I love what you're doing. I think you're changing our society one show at a time, and I hope that people just listen and take advantage of it for all that you offer.
Oh, wow. I humbly thank you for that. Wonderful. You're going to make me cry now. But thank you.
You've earned it.
Thank you, Lee J, so much again for joining us, and thank you for those who are in the Twitter chat and in our chat room itself, and for those listening online live. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you for listening to the Texas Conflict Coach. We hope you've enjoyed the program. You can find over 300 podcasts archived to listen at your own convenience at texasconflictcoach.com. or download the podcast at iTunes or Stitcher Radio. To learn about upcoming radio programs and resources, sign up for our monthly e-newsletter.